Okay, good evening. This is the first of two videos to wrap up Unit 2. This one will be about the Washington presidency. George Washington, our first president, will be a two-term president. And so let's dive into this. And then, of course, the second video will be the video on the John Adams presidency. Now, Washington's first term as president is going to be largely devoted to setting a template for what the president does all day. The Constitution is rather not vague, but it really doesn't give a lot of guidance on the president's day-to-day duties. And so Washington, who will be very aware that he is setting this template, will create the role, okay, that others will then follow. His second term will be spent with foreign affairs because both Britain and France are going to go to war with each other, and the United States will be caught in the middle. Ooh, look at that. It's got columns, so you know it's fancy. Now, one of the first things that happens in the Washington presidency, just go out to regular, is that political parties are going to form. As much as Washington tries to prevent the formation of political parties, they are going to form. And our first two political parties are going to be the Federalists and then what I'm going to call the Republicans. That is not today's Republican Party. Sometimes you will see them called Democratic Republicans in some books, but we're just going to call them Republicans just to keep it simple as possible. As far as leadership goes, the Federalist Party would largely be led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Republican Party Jefferson and Madison. And they will form over a variety of issues. So let's look at those. First of all, voting rights. Federalists wanted to restrict voting to as few people as possible. The Republicans want to expand voting rights to all white men. The breakdown here that separates the two groups is landowners. The Federalists wanted only people who owned land to be able to vote. The Republicans wanted all men, all white men, to be able to vote. So it really breaks down over land ownership. Second, how to interpret the Constitution. And, another big issue. Hamilton and the Federalist Party embraced what is called the implied powers argument, that the Constitution is not a book of directions like you get with a refrigerator or something, okay? It is not meant to spell out every single little detail that the government can and cannot do. Republicans strict interpretation. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. The National Bank. Now, we'll talk more about the National Bank in a few moments, but I'm going to bring it up here and talk about it. The Federalists wanted the bank. Okay? They felt that part of the government's job is to regulate trade and mint currency. So they felt that under the implied powers argument, if the government was going to make money, literally mint money, and regulate trade, it needed a bank to do so. It's an implied power because regulating trade and minting money are powers given specifically to the federal government. So the implied argument is we need a bank in order to do this. The Republican argument if the federal government wants to run a bank, should amend the Constitution. Okay. So it's a rejection of the implied powers argument. Government wants to become bankers, they need to pass an amendment to the Constitution to do that. Okay. So that is the argument between implied and strict interpretation. The third thing that divided them, should the federal government use its power to encourage a future of manufacturing or a future of agrarian growth? Federal government has a lot of power. The federal government has power over trade. The federal government has power with regards to transportation, with regards to making rivers safer, making ports safer, building roads, et cetera, et cetera. Should the government use that power to encourage a future where the United States becomes a great manufacturing power, or should the government use that power to make the United States a great agricultural power? Is really maybe a better word here. The Federalists are on the manufacturing part, and the agricultural part is on the Republican side. And then finally, who should we trade with? Who should be our principal trade partner? The Federalists will argue for the British. We have a long history of trade with Great Britain. We speak a common language. We have a common source of our law. Clearly should be the British. For the Republicans, they believe that the French represent less of a threat to the United States' future. Now, this argument's going to get complicated once war breaks out between Britain and France, and they both turn out to be giant assholes. Story we'll get to in a moment. As far as how these play out, voting rights will eventually, the Republicans will eventually win that one. Voting rights will expand to all white men in the 1820s and 1830s. Interpret the Constitution, that's still an argument we're having today. The National Bank will get built. We'll talk about that in a second. And manufacturing growth. And again, this question is going to get complicated because both Britain and France are going to harass us during their ongoing war. The other thing that happened in Washington's term was the establishment of Hamilton's financial program. Now, I don't know how much of this they talk about in the musical. I will assume none of it, and take you through this. Hamilton's financial program had two goals. Okay. One, use federal power to encourage the growth of manufacturing and trade. Okay. And we kind of already discussed that a few minutes ago. And then second was to tie wealthy interests to the federal government. Now, wealthy interests could be rich people, it could be corporations, it could be other countries, okay? But to tie wealthy interests to the federal government. We'll see how he does that in a second. Now, in order to achieve those goals, Hamilton has to solve two problems: revenue and credit. It's the two problems we all have to solve. The federal government needs to start making some money, and the federal government needs to become a good credit risk. Right. So here comes the Hamilton program. Let me start with revenue to begin with. Three sources of revenue: the sale of national domain, we talked about in class, a 5% import tax, so that's a tax on things coming into the United States from other countries, and then a 25% tax on whiskey manufacturing. Now that one, will lead to the Whiskey Rebellion, which is one of your outside readings. So I'm not going to talk about it very much, other than to compare and contrast government response. Okay, so that's revenue. Sales of the national domain, the 5% import tax, the 25% tax on whiskey manufacturing. Okay. Two, creation of the national bank. Now, I already talked about this with regards to implied powers, but this will give the government a place to deposit its money and a place to print currency. All right. So there's revenue. This is sort of tied to revenue. Now we need to talk about credit. Let me go to another slide. The national debt at this point is roughly $80 million. And most of that is from the war. And this also includes all the states. The federal government said it would take on the states' debts at this particular point. So what Hamilton wants to do is take that debt, repackage it as treasury bonds, and sell it to wealthy interests. Okay. Our government does this today. They issue treasury bonds as a way of getting some more money because our government needs more money than it takes in from taxes. How does this tie it to wealthy interests? For those of you who don't know, treasury bonds are issued for a period of years. You can buy a 5-year bond, you can buy a 10-year bond, a 20-year bond, etc. When they mature, so if you get a 20-year bond, in 20 years it matures, you get your money back plus the accrued interest. Right? So if I give the federal government, if I buy a treasury bond worth $100,000, I'm going to want my $100,000 back in 20 years plus all the interest. So if we sell those treasury bonds to rich people, rich companies, rich nations, those groups are going to want their money back. So those groups will use their influence to help the new United States survive. Okay? Because if the United States collapses, then these people are going to lose their money. But if the US survives, they get their money back plus the interest. Okay. So this is how we are going to tie the wealthy interest to the survival of the new federal government. Okay. It's a brilliant plan and it does work. Okay. We sell a lot of this debt, it raises immediate money that we need, and eventually it will all be paid off further on down the line. So that is the Hamilton program. Okay. As far as what kind of future that program is supposed to bring about, it is a future based on manufacturing. Hamilton believed that the United States' future lay in its manufacturing capabilities. And so what we saw really after the Civil War, really up through most of the 20th century, was Hamilton's vision come to life. A massive manufacturing base, a stable dollar, finance, banking, all that stuff was part of Hamilton's ultimate vision for the future. I do want to mention one thing about the Whiskey Rebellion, and that is the reaction of the US government compared to Shays' Rebellion. Now, we talked about Shays' Rebellion in class. That was in 1784. Tax rebellion, and the federal government had been unable to do anything about Shays' Rebellion. They had no money and they really didn't have much of an army. 8 years later, the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania, you have a new type of government. You have a government that has the power to draft an army if needed. You have the government that has the power to tax if needed to pay for the military. And so there is a robust federal reaction to the Whiskey Rebellion. George Washington himself will actually lead an army into Pennsylvania to deal with this. Now, most of the Whiskey Rebellion participants will, Washington shows up, scatter. I think only 2 people were ever arrested, and Washington pardoned them both for whatever role they may have had. But again, it is a very different reaction under the Constitution compared to what we saw under Shays' Rebellion under the old Articles of Confederation. French Revolution broke out in 1789, and this is going to cause a lot of problems for the United States. Initially, the French Revolution did look and sound like the American Revolution. It was largely a political revolution. That began to change in 1793, and then it turned into a social revolution where basically rich people were, if they hadn't been smart enough to get out of France, were guillotined. The church also meeting the guillotine as well. Louis XVI, the French king, and his wife, Marie Antoinette, will both be beheaded. And monarchs really don't like it when other monarchs are killed by their own people. George III may have not liked Louis XVI, but he didn't like the idea of Louis being executed by his own people. And so the French felt that it was their duty to crush this revolution. And there will be other groups that will come in to help the English. And so this is going to set off a war between Britain and France from about 1794 off and on till about 1815. So this will eventually encompass the Continental Wars, or Napoleonic Wars, as they're sometimes called. And the United States will be caught up in all of this. Both the US under George Washington will declare neutrality. We are not getting involved in Europe's petty problems. Thank you very much. Britain and France, though, both want us on their side. Okay. Primarily, they want our agricultural surplus. Okay. The fact is, the United States grows a lot of food, and armies need food. So both want us on their side, and that's going to lead both the British and the French to begin piracy. Well, specifically, let me roll it back. The British will do two things. There's piracy, which is bad enough, but there's also impressments. Impressments is essentially naval kidnapping. A British naval ship would stop an American ship and just take whoever they wanted and put them into the British Navy. Okay. And if you don't want to go, then the British will just shoot you and toss your body overboard, and that's the end of that. So this is really kidnapping. But the British were doing it. They will continue to do it over the next 20 years. So we got pirates on one side who are also impressing. On the French side, we also have piracy as well. So it really puts the United States in a very difficult position. Washington will decide that we need to cut some kind of deal with the British. The British are the greater threat to Americans in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. And so Washington decides we need to cut a new deal with the British. Okay. And here are the issues. Okay. Impressments. There are British troops in the Great Lake region, even years later. 10 years after the wars ended, there are still British troops occupying American soil. And when the British practice impressment, they also take the cargo, and sometimes they'll just take the ship. John Jay sent to Britain to negotiate with the British. He's Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he goes over there and negotiates with the British, and he comes back with a treaty that is called Jay's Treaty. It has one of those really long 18th century names that nobody uses, but we'll just call it Jay's Treaty. So what's in the treaty? Let's take a look. One, the British will withdraw their troops from U.S. soil. Okay, better late than never. Britain will pay for stolen merchandise and ships. Fantastic. 3, mission to work out the U.S.-Canada border. We still did not know where the U.S.-Canadian border was. And so we and the British felt we should kind of get that set up. So far, this is looking like a pretty good treaty. 4, remember in the Treaty of Paris, it talked about how, or I talked about how, you know, if you hadn't paid your bills, like maybe you got a bunch of furniture from England and then the war broke out and you never bothered to pay your bills. If you still haven't paid your bills 10 years later, the federal government is going to take care of that now. So congratulations on being a debtor. The government will now pay that off. And 5, restricts U.S. trade with France. These are all pretty good things, okay? We get the British off of our soil, which is probably the most important part of this whole thing. They pay for stolen merchandise. We get the border worked out eventually, pay off pre-war debts, and we don't stop trading with France, but we do restrict some of what we trade with France. So why is this treaty so unpopular? Because it was extremely unpopular when the American government when the American public got a hold of it. There's nothing about impressment in that treaty at all. And in fact, impressment will never be dealt with in any of the treaties that the United States makes with Britain now and even in 1814. Impressment will never show up in the treaties. Now, John Jay can negotiate a treaty. John Jay can sign a treaty, but the Senate has to ratify a treaty. Okay. If you look in the Constitution, 2/3 of the Senate must ratify a treaty before it goes into effect. So the Senate, who are not really terribly happy about the treaty, they asked to see the instructions that John Jay had been given. Instant communication is, of course, impossible in the 18th century. It could still take 2 months. So when John Jay went to London, he would have been given instructions about, like, what do we have to have in the treaty? What absolutely has to be there? What can we jettison? And what can we kind of negotiate with to get the things we want? And so the Senate wanted to know, like, were impressments even important in the instructions? Right? These are instructions that George Washington would have worked out along with his Secretary of State. Um, where did impressments fall in importance? Were they very important? Were they kind of important? Were they not important? Where are they? Washington refuses to share these instructions. Where does the Constitution allow him to do that? It does not. Washington creates a new power for the presidency, not given by the Constitution. It's not there. Washington says, and I quote, "The nature of foreign negotiations requires caution, and the success of negotiations the success of negotiations often depends upon secrecy." So again, this is a new power that the president can negotiate with foreign countries and not tell Congress what he's doing. Now, is that a power that has been abused by presidents? Yes. Okay. But it has also been an important power for presidents to use when negotiating with foreign powers. So it's often who's wielding the power as to whether it's abused or not. But it is a new power created by the president. Jay's treaty passes. It does get through. Again, looking at it, the most important thing is it did get British troops off of American soil. Now, this one is going to cause problems for us with France. I'll talk about that in the John Adams video. Okay. The other good thing about Jay's treaty leads directly to Pinckney's treaty the following year, 1795, between the US and Spain. And this is a funny story. In the 18th and 19th century, when two nations made a treaty, or three nations, it was assumed that there were secret parts of the treaty that were not written down. Now, that's illegal today. Or it's supposed to be illegal today because it's kind of why World War I happened. So when this treaty got published, a treaty between the United States and Great Britain, other nations assumed that there were secret agreements that were not published because that's what everybody did. Now, the United States did not do that in Jay's treaty, but the Spanish believed that had been the case, and Spain thus proceeded to freak out about U.S. British friendships. Spain became convinced that the U.S. and Britain had a secret agreement to take New Orleans and Florida. Now, there was no secret agreement to do that. It's not there. But Spain didn't know that. And we sure as hell weren't going to tell the Spanish that. So Spain came to us to make a treaty, right? We didn't go to Spain asking for a treaty. They came to us because they were so freaked out about our rapprochement with Great Britain. So this leads to Pinckney's Treaty, which does two things with regards to our relationship with Spain. One, it establishes the 31st parallel as the U.S. Spanish-Florida border. If you look at a map of the United States today, Florida's northern border that it shares with Georgia, Alabama, and I think Mississippi. I've been looking at maps of 18th century Florida. That's the 31st parallel. It's the modern Florida border. Remember, Spain had been claiming about 2/3 of Georgia and Alabama for itself. They're now giving up that claim to 2/3 of what are now Georgia and Alabama. So we get the treaty we want. We get the border we want it. Second thing it does, you remember way back in 1784, we talked about this in class when Spain had closed New Orleans to American trade. Spain now gives the United States called the right of deposit. And what that means, when you as an American, first it opens New Orleans back up again for American trade, which is very important. Remember though, when you as an American are taking your wheat or your corn or whatever to New Orleans, you are legally entering another nation. And so you have to pay import taxes. The right of deposit means there are no import taxes for US goods, okay? So it not only opens New Orleans, it gives us a really good deal with regards to taking our products, our wheat, our tobacco, our timber, our whatever. We don't have to pay import taxes on it. So it's really good for the Western economy to get that deal. So, and again, this is what Spain brought to us because they were so freaked out by our friendship with the British. And that allows George Washington to go out on a high note. He will step down after 2 terms and return to Mount Vernon, although he'll only live for a couple of more years before he dies. And that is it for the Washington presidency. I will see you in the Adams presidency in the next video. All right, good night.